Ethan sat alone in the dimly lit room, the quiet hum of the old house surrounding him. His hands trembled slightly as he carefully opened the yellowed envelope, a letter from his late father, one that he never knew existed. His father, the man who had left without a word, had somehow left behind a trail of secrets. As the paper crinkled under his fingers, Ethan read the words that would forever change his perception of everything. A life he thought he understood was now full of unanswered questions. His heart raced as he read on, his mind unable to comprehend the depth of the hidden truth. This discovery was not just a letter. It was a revelation of an entire past his father had concealed. The world felt as though it had shifted beneath his feet, and the world outside seemed too small, too insignificant compared to the gravity of what he had just uncovered. Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by the rush of emotions flooding his mind. Anger, confusion, grief. His father had been more than just the man who left them behind. There was a history, a depth to him that Ethan had never known. What was this secret? What had it cost to keep it hidden for so long? Ethan stood there, staring at the paper, barely noticing the time slipping away, a sense of dread creeping up his spine. How long had this truth been buried? And what would he do with it now? Ethan sat down on the couch, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the letter. He couldn't shake the feeling that the discovery was only the beginning of something much larger. His father's secret seemed to be unraveling before him, but the truth felt too distant, like trying to grasp smoke with his bare hands. With each passing minute, his anxiety grew. He never knew his father was capable of such hidden layers, and yet the weight of the journal's words was undeniable. Ethan struggled to understand why his father had kept these truths locked away, only to be found now. It felt like an intrusion, a violation of a relationship he thought he understood. As the clock ticked on, the silence in the room grew louder, and Ethan could feel the burden of the past pressing in on him. Could he trust the message in the letter? What did it mean for his own life now? Ethan sat in the dimly lit study, the faint smell of old books filling the air. The weight of the discovery was still fresh, and his mind raced with questions that seemed to spiral into more confusion. Just as he was about to lose himself in his thoughts, there was a knock at the door. It was Elder Thomas, a man who had been a close family friend for years. His calm presence filled the room, a stark contrast to the storm inside Ethan's mind. Thomas, in his late 70s, had seen and understood things that Ethan could only begin to grasp. His voice was a soothing balm in the midst of Ethan's emotional chaos. "You've uncovered something, haven't you?" Elder Thomas said gently, sitting across from Ethan. His eyes, full of wisdom, seemed to peer straight into Ethan's soul. "Not all truths are meant to be faced alone," he continued, his tone thoughtful. Ethan felt the weight of the words. Was he ready to hear the full story? And what exactly was it that Thomas knew? The room felt smaller now, as though every word held. Ethan's thoughts were clouded as he met with Maya, his longtime friend and the person who had always been the voice of reason in his life. She could sense the tension in the air before he even spoke. "What's going on, Ethan?" she asked, her brow furrowed with concern. He handed her the letter, his hands shaking slightly as he did. Maya took it from him, her eyes scanning the words quickly, then lifting her gaze back to him. "You really believe this?" she asked, her voice skeptical, almost disbelieving. Maya, always practical and grounded, struggled to understand the depths of Ethan's emotional turmoil. She didn't know what it was like to feel as though everything you thought you knew about your life had been a lie. To her, it seemed almost too unbelievable, too far-fetched to trust. Ethan's gaze dropped to the floor, and he struggled to answer. He wanted to believe the letter, to trust the emotions it stirred within him, but there was a nagging doubt in the back of his mind. What if it's not true? Maya Later that evening, as the rain began to fall in heavy sheets outside, Ethan received a phone call that shifted everything. The voice on the other end was familiar, but the words spoken were far from ordinary. It was from the executor of his late father's estate. There were more things to uncover, more truths hidden within the house that Ethan had not yet discovered. "Your father left something behind, something that must be addressed," the voice on the other end said, its tone serious. You need to come back to the house." The moment the call ended, Ethan felt a chill run through him. The weight of his father's secrets had not been fully revealed yet. He knew then that he had no choice but to return to the place he'd always wanted to forget. The house, the memories, everything he had buried in his mind, was calling him back. He stood by the window, watching the storm rage outside, feeling the storm within him grow as well. Ethan stood at the front door of his childhood home. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt like a prison, filled with old memories and unspoken words. As he stepped inside, every corner of the house seemed to whisper secrets from the past. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he knew he had to face the place where so much of his pain had started. Walking through the rooms, each one seemed to hold a different chapter of his life. His father's absence loomed large, and yet, Ethan knew he couldn't run from it anymore. The past was waiting for him to confront it, and today was the day. Ethan stopped in front of a large family portrait, his younger self standing next to his father. The smile in the picture felt distant, as though it belonged to strangers. As he stared at the photo, memories of his father's harshness and emotional distance flooded back. The house was no longer a home. It was a museum of things he couldn't change. Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by a deep sorrow. His father had been a man of contradictions, capable of love, yet unable to show it in a way Ethan could understand. The truth, buried under years of resentment, was beginning to surface, but Ethan didn't yet know how to deal with it. Ethan wandered into his father's study, where old books and papers lay scattered on the desk. The room smelled of dust and old leather, a place where his father spent countless hours, often lost in his thoughts. Ethan found a stack of leather-bound journals and pulled the top one free. The handwriting was familiar, his father's voice now filling the silence. As he flipped through the pages, he read about struggles and regrets, about a man who tried to protect his family, but had failed in his own way. Ethan felt a mix of anger and compassion, unsure of whether he could forgive what had been done. But as he read, he began to understand that his father, too, had been trapped by his own fears. Sitting in his father's chair, Ethan let the journal fall open in his hands. His father's words painted a picture of a man who was flawed, yet deeply human. Ethan realized that his father's love, hidden beneath layers of pride and guilt, had always been there, just in a form he couldn't understand. He closed the journal, allowing the weight of the revelation to settle within him. The pain of his past wasn't just his father's fault, it was the result of both their misunderstandings. But in that moment, Ethan began to let go of the anger he had carried for so long. The burden wasn't just his father's, it was theirs. Ethan called Maya that evening, needing to hear her voice. He had been processing everything, and he needed someone to remind him that he wasn't alone. "You're stronger than you think," Maya said, her voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to have all the answers, just take it one step at a time." Ethan smiled, feeling the warmth of her words. She had always known how to ground him. "Thank you," he said softly. "I don't think I could do this without you." Maya's reassurance gave him the strength to keep going. He wasn't alone in this, and that thought made all the difference. Ethan returned to Elder Thomas for guidance, feeling lost in the aftermath of his discoveries. As he sat across from Thomas, he expressed his overwhelming frustration. "I don't know what to do with all of this," Ethan admitted. Thomas listened quietly, then spoke with calm assurance. "The journey to healing begins not with answers, but with acceptance. You can't change the past, but you can decide how it shapes you." Ethan nodded, realizing that the true challenge was to find peace, not perfection. For the first time, he understood that healing was less about fixing everything and more about accepting the imperfections. Ethan's internal conflict continued to simmer. The doubts and old fears still lingered. Each night, he found himself grappling with the weight of his father's legacy and his own guilt. Could he truly forgive? Was he capable of changing his own mindset after years of carrying the past? As Ethan stared into the night, he felt torn between the desire to move forward and the pull of old wounds. But deep down, he knew that to truly heal, he would have to face these fears head-on, no longer running from them. Maya once again confronted Ethan, this time challenging his journey. "How can you be sure you're ready for all this?" she asked, her tone skeptical. "Maybe it's too much. Maybe it's easier to let the past stay buried." Ethan felt the sting of her words but also recognized that they were coming from a place of care. He knew Maya feared he was opening old wounds that might tear him apart. "I can't keep running from this," Ethan replied firmly. "I need to understand for my own peace." Maya fell silent, seeing the determination in his eyes. While she still had doubts, she knew that Ethan had to walk this path on his own. Ethan continued to pore over his father's journals, and one evening he stumbled upon a letter addressed to him. It read, "I did what I thought was best for you, even when you couldn't understand. I loved you, Ethan, in my own way." The truth, painful yet liberating, hit Ethan with full force. His father had loved him, but had struggled to show it. The realization that his father's actions, though imperfect, were motivated by love, was a turning point. The anger Ethan had carried began to dissipate, replaced by a deeper understanding of the man his father had been. Standing at his father's grave, Ethan felt a weight lift off his shoulders. "I forgive you," he whispered, a sense of peace settling over him. The cycle of bitterness, anger, and regret had finally been broken. He no longer saw his father as a figure of cruelty, but as a man who had done his best, even if it was flawed. Ethan's forgiveness wasn't just for his father, but for himself too. He was free from the weight of the past. As he walked away from the grave, he felt a sense of clarity and renewal. The journey to healing had begun in earnest. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. The journals had given him some closure, but there were still unanswered questions that tugged at the corners of his mind. One evening, as he was sorting through old boxes in the attic, he found a hidden compartment beneath a loose floorboard. His heart raced as he pried it open, revealing a collection of faded letters and photographs. As he sifted through the documents, one particular letter caught his attention. It was addressed to him, written in his father's handwriting, but the words were different. "I never wanted you to know this, Ethan," the letter began. "The truth of your mother's passing has been kept hidden for years. I made a promise to protect you from it." Ethan's hands trembled as he read the letter, his eyes widening with disbelief. The pain he had carried for so long about his mother's death was nothing like he had imagined. The truth his father had hidden was more than just a family secret. It was a web of lies that had effect. Ethan needed guidance, and he knew exactly where to go. He returned to Elder Thomas' home, the weight of the letter still fresh in his mind. He found Thomas sitting by the fire, a quiet presence in the otherwise still room. After a long pause, Ethan handed him the letter, the words still burning in his mind. Thomas read it slowly, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he placed the letter on the table and met Ethan's gaze. "I feared this day would come," he said quietly. "Your father never wanted you to know the full truth, but you've now uncovered a part of the past that cannot be ignored." Ethan's voice trembled as he asked, "What happened, Thomas? What was the real story?" Thomas sighed deeply, his eyes distant as he recalled the events. "Your mother's death wasn't an accident, Ethan. It was the result of a tragic series of events, one that your father tried to protect you from. He didn't want you to carry that burden, but it was inevitable." Ethan sat down, his mind racing. The truth he had been Ethan walked away from Elder Thomas' house, feeling as though his world had just been turned upside down. The truth about his mother's death, the lies that had been kept from him, and the realization that his father had carried the burden of these secrets alone all these years made everything feel surreal. He wandered through the quiet streets of the village, lost in thought, when he stumbled upon an old man sitting on a bench near the park. The man was in his late 70s, with gray hair and deep lines etched into his face. Ethan had seen him around the village before, but he had never spoken to him. The old man looked at Ethan, his eyes piercing and wise. "You've been carrying a heavy weight, haven't you?" he asked, his voice soft but knowing. Ethan froze, startled by the man's words. "How do you know?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. The old man smiled gently. "I've seen your pain. I've seen it in your eyes. But you have a choice now, young man. You can let the past control you, or you can let it shape you. Later that evening, Ethan stood in front of his father's grave once again, the weight of the truth heavy in his heart. He had spent the past few days processing everything he had learned, the lies, the pain, and the truth about his mother's death. It wasn't easy, and it never would be. But Ethan had come to understand that his father's actions, though flawed, were always driven by love, a love that had been buried beneath layers of pride, fear, and regret. As he stood at the grave, Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the cool breeze on his face. "I understand now," he whispered. "I understand why you did what you did. I forgive you." The words felt freeing, like a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt at peace with his father's choices. He wasn't just forgiving him for the past, but also for himself. The years of resentment and anger had taken their toll. But now Ethan could finally move forward. The weight of the past no longer controlled him. He was free. As Ethan walked away from the grave, he felt a sense of calm that he hadn't felt in years. But as he turned the corner, he was confronted with a final test. A man from his father's past appeared, someone Ethan had heard of but never met, a business partner of his father's who had once been close to the family. The man, in his mid-60s, looked at Ethan with a mix of sadness and regret. "Your father and I made mistakes," he said. "But what you don't know is that I promised him I would never let you find out about this. He wanted to protect you from the truth. But maybe it's time you knew the full story." Ethan's heart raced again. What more could there possibly be? The man's words were like a final twist in the story that had been unfolding. Ethan took a deep breath, preparing himself for whatever was coming next. He had faced the past, forgiven, and reconciled. But was he truly ready to hear everything? Ethan had spent days replaying everything in his mind. The journals, the conversations with Thomas, the letter from his father, and the mysterious encounter in the cemetery. It was as though the universe had conspired to bring him to this exact moment. Sitting alone on a park bench, Ethan finally felt as though the last piece of the puzzle had clicked into place. He had carried so much weight, not just from his father's past, but from his own guilt and regret. The truth he had been searching for was not some grand revelation about his father's mistakes, but rather about his own ability to forgive. It wasn't about understanding every action or every choice his father had made. It was about releasing the grip that the past had on him. He had been living for so long in the shadow of a man he thought was perfect, and when that image had shattered, Ethan didn't know how to move forward. But now, he realized that true peace wasn't found in the absence of pain, but in the acceptance of it. He wasn't defined by high. The following days were filled with a strange calm, yet Ethan knew that the true test was still ahead of him. The hardest battle wasn't against the past or his father's mistakes. It was against the voice in his head that still questioned his worth. He would sit alone at night, staring at his father's journal, feeling the pull of the old wounds that hadn't quite healed. The weight of it all would sometimes overwhelm him, and he could hear his father's stern voice echoing in his mind, telling him he wasn't enough. But he knew now that those were lies. Ethan was more than his father's image of him. He was more than the expectations placed on him. The next time he heard that voice, he would no longer listen. He would speak his truth, loudly and firmly, for the first time. As he sat in the stillness of his room, a wave of clarity swept over him. He would no longer be afraid to confront his inner demons. It was time to confront the shadow of his past and reclaim his own identity. The moment of truth came when Ethan found himself face to face with the business partner who had been a part of his father's past. This man, the final piece of the puzzle, was not just someone from his father's life. He was a reminder of the man Ethan had been afraid to become. As Ethan entered the dimly lit office where the man waited, a part of him hesitated. This man had known things about his father that Ethan hadn't been prepared to hear. "You're here because your father wanted you to know the truth," the man said, his voice filled with regret. Ethan nodded, his heart pounding. "I need to understand. What really happened with my mother?" The man hesitated before speaking again. "It wasn't your father's fault, Ethan. He was just as trapped in the situation as your mother. It was a tragic accident, one that could have been avoided, but your father loved her deeply. He did what he thought was right, to protect you and your mother's memory." Ethan listened, his mind racing, but now he could finally hear that. Later that night, as Ethan sat by the window of his apartment, the city lights twinkling below, he felt a sense of renewal. The man he had once feared becoming, the person who was defined by his father's legacy, no longer existed. In his place stood someone who understood the importance of healing, of embracing imperfections, and of finding peace in the messiness of life. The pain would never fully disappear, but it no longer controlled him. As he stared out into the distance, Ethan smiled softly. The past had shaped him, but it would not define him anymore. He was free to forge his own path. He had come to terms with his father's legacy, and in doing so, had discovered his own. The journey had been long, but it had brought him to this moment, a moment where he could finally breathe without the weight of the world on his shoulders. His rebirth was not about forgetting the past, but about embracing it and moving forward with a heart open to the future. As the sun rose the next morning, Ethan took one last look at the life he had left behind. The grief, the resentment, the weight of past mistakes. All of it seemed so distant now, like a dream he had long since woken from. The dawn was more than just the start of a new day. It was the start of a new chapter in his life. He didn't know exactly where it would lead, but for the first time he didn't need to know. What mattered was that he was no longer trapped by the shadows of the past. Ethan stepped out into the light, ready to embrace whatever came next, with a heart full of hope and a spirit that had been renewed. The journey wasn't over, but he had found the strength to move forward, and that was enough. Ethan's life had taken a turn, and the weight of everything he had uncovered was beginning to feel less like a burden and more like a part of his personal growth. Over the past few weeks, he had gradually started to rebuild his relationships with those who had been there for him through the darkest moments. Maya, Thomas, even the old man from the park. But it wasn't just about others. For the first time, Ethan began to rebuild his relationship with himself. He woke up each morning with a new sense of purpose, a clarity that he hadn't felt before. The anger that once consumed him was gone, replaced with a calm sense of acceptance. He understood now that healing wasn't a linear process, but it was a journey, one that couldn't be rushed. In his quiet moments, Ethan would sit by the window of his apartment, watching the world outside, feeling the gentle rhythm of life as it moved around him. He had made peace with his past, but more importantly, he had made peace with himself. He didn't need to be defined by H. Maya sat across from Ethan at a small cafe, her eyes warm as they always were. It had been a while since they had spoken in person, but they had stayed in touch through the phone. Today, however, they sat together, their conversation flowing easily, as it always had. Maya knew Ethan had been through a lot, but she also knew he had changed. There was a lightness to him now, a sense of peace she hadn't seen before. "You look different," she remarked, a smile tugging at her lips. "Like you've finally let go of something." Ethan chuckled softly, nodding. "I think I've let go of a lot of things," he replied. "The anger, the fear, the idea that I needed to have all the answers." Maya took a sip of her coffee, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm proud of you, Ethan," she said, her voice sincere. "I've watched you struggle, but I also saw you fight through it all. You're stronger than you think." Ethan's expression softened. "It wasn't just me fighting," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You were there. Thomas was there. You all helped me see that I don't have to be perfect." Maya reached across the table, squeezing his hand gently. "No one's perfect, Ethan, and you're better for it." Ethan smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to explain himself. Maya understood. Ethan returned to the family home one last time, the place that had once felt like a prison to him, now standing as a symbol of his growth. He had spent years avoiding this house, afraid of what it represented. But now, with a sense of closure, he stood in front of it, the past no longer holding him captive. He entered the house, walking through the familiar rooms that once felt cold and distant. The walls no longer seemed oppressive. Instead, they felt like a canvas, a reflection of the life he had lived there. Ethan wandered through the halls, stopping in the study where he had first read his father's journals. He had come to terms with the fact that his father had been flawed, but so was he. They were both human, bound by their struggles, yet capable of love and change. In the center of the room, Ethan paused before the desk. His father's presence still lingered in the room, but it no longer felt like a shadow. It was just a memory, a part of his journey. "I forgive you," Ethan whispered to the room. And, Ethan woke up early the next morning, the world outside his window bathed in the soft light of dawn. It was a new day, a new chapter in his life. As he stepped out onto the balcony, he looked out at the city below, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of his father's past on his shoulders. He wasn't defined by his family's history, nor by the mistakes he had made. He was free to pursue his own dreams, to carve out his own future. The journey he had been on had changed him, but it had also taught him something invaluable: the importance of embracing uncertainty and allowing himself the space to grow. He had learned that wisdom wasn't about having all the answers. It was about accepting the questions and being willing to face them. With a deep breath, Ethan turned away from the view, ready to start the day. His future was unwritten, but he was no longer afraid of the unknown. He was ready to live it. Months passed, and as Ethan's life moved forward, he found himself in moments of reflection. He had started working at a job that fulfilled him. He had reconnected with old friends, and he had learned to embrace the quieter moments of life. The healing that had begun in the darkest of places was now thriving in the light. He no longer carried the ghosts of his father's past or the weight of his own insecurities. Each day he woke up with a sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought him here. There were still days when the old doubts crept in, but Ethan had learned not to run from them. He faced them with understanding and compassion, knowing that they were simply part of his ongoing transformation. Life wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. As he sat on a park bench one afternoon, watching the world go by, Ethan smiled. He had learned the greatest lesson of all: that healing wasn't an end, but a beginning. And it was a beginning that could last a lifetime. Ethan had spent so much of his life running from his past, trying to escape the shadow of his father, that he had forgotten what it felt like to truly be himself. But now, as he stood in front of a mirror, he saw the person he had always been, not just the son, not just the man defined by his struggles, but a man who had learned, grown, and transformed. The reflection in front of him wasn't perfect, and that was okay. He had come to understand that the pursuit of perfection was an illusion. Life was about embracing the ebb and flow, the highs and lows, and finding balance in between. As he looked at himself, Ethan smiled, not out of pride, but out of acceptance. He had stopped chasing answers and had begun to live the questions. This was the man he had always been meant to be, free, not from the past, but from the need to be defined by it. He was a work in progress, as everyone was, but now, he was finally able to stand tall, not in spite of his history, but because of it. Ethan had returned to Elder Thomas's home one last time, feeling the pull of wisdom that had guided him through his journey. The old man sat by the fire, his gaze steady as he welcomed Ethan with a knowing smile. "You've come a long way," Thomas said, his voice filled with a quiet pride. Ethan nodded, sitting down across from him. "I never could have done it without you," he replied sincerely. Thomas chuckled softly. "I only gave you the tools, Ethan. You were the one who used them." The two men sat in companionable silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Ethan realized how much he had changed, from the confused and angry young man who had walked into Thomas's life to the man who now sat before him, calm and self-aware. "Thank you," Ethan said, his voice thick with gratitude. Thomas smiled warmly. "It was your journey to take. All I did was help you find your way back to yourself." Ethan stood, his heart full of gratitude. "I will carry what you've taught me with me for the rest of my life." Though Ethan had come a long way in his healing process, there was still one last shadow to face: the part of himself he had never fully embraced. It had always been easy to point to his father's mistakes or the pain of the past, but the hardest part of his journey was facing the darker parts of himself, the self-doubt, the guilt, the insecurities that had shaped his decisions for years. That afternoon, in the stillness of his apartment, Ethan sat in front of his desk, the journals and letters from his father spread out before him. The presence of his father, once oppressive, now felt different. It was no longer a burden, but a catalyst for change. As he read the final words in his father's journals, Ethan could hear his father's voice. Not the voice of criticism, but the voice of someone who had wanted him to find peace. "You are enough," he read aloud, his voice steady. "You always have been." The weight that had always been there seemed to lift from his shoulders. For the first time, he fully embraced tea. As Ethan stood at his father's grave once more, he felt the weight of everything he had learned settle within him. The journey had been long, filled with unexpected twists and painful realizations. But now, he understood that his father's legacy was not one of mistakes and regrets, but of love. Flawed, yes, but love, nonetheless. "I've let go," Ethan whispered to the gravestone, his voice soft but clear. "And I've forgiven you, Dad. I've forgiven myself." The words felt like a final chapter being written, one that was no longer burdened by the anger and resentment that had defined his relationship with his father. He looked up at the sky, the clouds breaking to reveal the sun's rays. The moment felt sacred, as if the universe itself was acknowledging his healing. "I will carry you with me," Ethan continued, "but I will no longer carry your pain." As he turned to leave, he realized that he had finally created his own legacy, one built on acceptance, understanding, and peace. With the final chapter of his past behind him, Ethan felt a new energy in his heart. He had taken the lessons from his father, the wisdom of his mentors, and the strength he had discovered within himself, and had turned them into something powerful. The journey had not been easy, and it was far from over, but for the first time, Ethan was truly living. He walked into a new chapter of his life, his mind clear, and his heart open. He had learned that the greatest wisdom came not from the answers, but from the willingness to keep asking the questions. Life would continue to challenge him, but he was no longer afraid. He was ready. Ready for love, for growth, for everything that was yet to come. He was no longer the man haunted by his past. He was the man who had found peace, and in doing so, had found his purpose.